Hi, I'm Michael Bader. I'm a psychologist with over 30 years experience, and I've been with the Institute for Change for about 7 years now. And over that time, I've had the great privilege to work with hundreds of SEIU leaders in a variety of contexts, and hopefully I bring with me today the experience not only of my own clinical work, but of my work with union leaders. And today I want to talk about motivation, about what makes people tick, about what people need. In the 1950s and 1960s, a psychologist named Abraham Maslow, who many of you may know, put these assumptions into the shape of a pyramid. Okay, so here's the pyramid. And you can see that in Maslow's pyramid, there's a natural hierarchy to what people need. At the bottom are survival needs, and we could call them, for our purposes, economic needs. And then comes successively safety, love, self-esteem, and then at the top, of course, self-actualization. Now, here's the key thing, though. Maslow, and many of us, I think, believe that unless you address and satisfy these lower needs first, the more basic needs first, you can't really develop as a person. You can't meet higher order needs until you've met lower order needs. And that seems like common sense. And unions believe it, as do most of us. I would say this, that you primarily address your members' economic needs, and secondarily, their needs for security. And in particular, the security of having some protection from the arbitrary power of the boss. Other needs that people have, needs for recognition or meaning or relatedness or a sense of agency or creativity, these might come up briefly in a campaign or around a strike, but when the crisis is over, you're back to basics. You're back to what you assume are the most basic, important needs of your members. Now, let me say this. Based on my 30 years of clinical experience, my very extensive, actually, review of the literature in this area, and my 7 years of working with SEIU, I have to tell you that Maslow was wrong. These needs, what he considers the foundational needs, the economic survival needs, are not more important than other needs. Human motivation, in other words, is not a hierarchy. Your members have needs for things that are every bit as important and at times urgent for them, other than economic security and protection. And unless you appreciate that and figure out how to connect with these other needs, you'll always just be an emergency brake and never really a central part of the engine that moves your members' lives. So we're going to blow up this pyramid. And we're going to instead replace it with another image. It's an image of concentric circles, each of which represents what I consider to be one of the 5 fundamental needs that animate people and that animate your members. And you'll see, one of them is the need for meaning, which is the need to connect with something bigger than the self. Another one is recognition, which is the need to be seen and to be understood for who you really are. Another one is a need for what I call agency, which is the need to have your own voice, to influence the world around you, to be creative and to learn. And you have a need for relationships, which is the need to be connected to others in some kind of community of relationship that's both mutual and reciprocal. And of course, you still have, very importantly, survival needs. The need to have healthy environments, the need to have adequate nutrition and health care, and all of the things that we know are important for people's survival and growth. Now here's the main point here. A movement is going to be maximally successful to the extent that it addresses all 5 of these needs. To the extent it addresses all 5 of these needs. So, you might ask, what's the evidence that these needs don't stack up and look like a pyramid? Doesn't it seem like common sense that, well, we can't be talking to folks about the meaning of their lives if they're starving, right? Well, actually wrong. That's wrong. People put their needs for meaning and their needs for other things above their survival needs all the time. There's overwhelming scientific evidence that conclusively shows, at the very least, the following. And I'll just tick off some of the streams of evidence that I think support this. Soldiers risk their lives every day out of loyalty to their squad. Suicide bombers do so, obviously, out of loyalty to their God. People routinely work for less money for companies and organizations in which they get a lot of recognition. People in social movements risk life and limb, often for the sake of a cause. Residents of nursing homes, residents of nursing homes would rather have more social contact and control over their surroundings than they would have better medical care. It's been shown. Children routinely choose to stay in families that are abusive and damaging to their health rather than leave their families and threaten the attachment that they have. Another very interesting example to me is in the 1940s in England, they had these large orphanages. They called them foundling homes, where they had babies and toddlers that had been orphaned during the war or had been sent there from London during the bombing. And they started to notice many of these children were getting sick and some were even dying. And they couldn't understand it because they were getting good health care and they were well fed and clothed. And what they discovered was that they weren't being held. And when they picked up these babies and these toddlers and held them several times a day, made eye contact, had a connection, the children stopped getting sick and they stopped dying. Because their attachment needs outweighed their survival needs, or was actually a key to their survival. We see data all the time that people who have strong spiritual practices, they recover from illnesses quicker. Their rehabilitation is shorter. People that suffer the absence of relationships, people who are lonely, it's found over and over again their immune systems are suppressed, their blood pressure goes up, they get poor sleep, and they even have greater inflammatory responses in their bodies correlated with nothing other than loneliness. So there's a lot of evidence that this notion that you have to prioritize economic or biological needs is wrong. So let's take these things up one at a time, these needs. The first is relationship needs, okay? The central core longing for and need for connectedness to others. The absence of which, of course, is what we mean by loneliness. Loneliness is a scourge in this country. And while it's more common in men than women, it's true in both sexes. And you can see from the slide, which makes fun of the lonely man, but of course we know that this is a problem in both men and women. And I came upon recently an interesting study. In 1985, a large national study was done asking people this question: how many real confidants do you have in your life? And in 1985, the most common number of confidants mentioned was 3. That's not the mean, it's the most common number mentioned. 20 years later, they did the identical study. What do you think the most common number was then? 0. 0 confidants. That's what a problem loneliness is in this country. If you ask any therapist, what's the worst damage they see in their patients? If they're honest, what they'll say is it's not abuse. It's actually neglect. It's absence and deprivation. As I mentioned before, you know, and I'm sure you all know this or have seen this, kids would rather be with a bad parent than with no parent. Attachment trumps physical safety and survival. We all know this, but we don't ask ourselves why. Why is that? It's because attachment and relationships are so centrally important, perhaps more important than anything else. You can see on this slide, the slide of the Lovebirds, that we are, in fact, programmed to love each other. Our brains secrete a hormone called oxytocin when we're connected, which is the same hormone actually that nursing mothers secrete when they're nursing. Think of making eye contact with a baby. Your own baby, someone else's baby. What happens? Okay? Well, you can see the baby start to respond physically when you're smiling and you're connected to the baby. The baby can't speak. The baby starts to physically gyrate and coo and make noise and smile and vibrate, almost as if something has been turned on, a switch has been turned on, and it has. It's the attachment switch. It's the pleasure of attachment. It's so central. Now, as organizers, I think, you're all intuitively aware of this in some way, because the key to having any effect or influence on members is developing a relationship with them. But here's the point that I want to make about that, is that relationships, what people are hungry for in the way of relationships, has to have the following dimension. It has to have the quality that the person is treated less as a means to an end than as an end in himself. That is, every day people are treated as a means to an end. You know, we're consumers and taxpayers, and we're dues-paying members of a union where money and service is expected of us, and we come home and sometimes we feel we're a means to an end there too. And almost nowhere is anyone ever interested in us just for us. And now I'm not saying that the union ought to replace what should belong in a family, but there has to be a dimension of your relationships that really have to do with a genuine curiosity and eagerness to get to know the person, because that my friends, is a rare experience. And when people have that experience, they know it and they respond. Now, think about this idea that no one is interested just in you. Now, look at this next slide. Okay? You have Reverend Rick Warren and his Saddleback megachurch coming along and saying this: God loves you, and so do I. God is more interested in what you are than in what you do. That's why we're called human beings and not human doings. Now, you know, whatever you think of Rick Warren and that quote, what do you think the effect is of this message and these practices on people who are lonely, with few confidants, on people who feel used and viewed as a means to an end so much in their life? And how would you compare the growth of his organization with the growth of ours? See, might there be some connection here? Obviously, I think there is. So the question to you is simple here. How and in what way do you foster the formation and maintenance of relationships with your members? Relationships with your members and relationships between your members. How many of your conversations are relatively brief and end with an ask of some kind versus have the quality of a genuine curiosity and inquiry into who they are as people? In other words, how much are they means to your end and you a means to their end, rather than the relationship being really mutual? Maybe my point is, you have thousands of members out there who are hungry. Even though, I'll grant you, many of them may not even know it or may not be able to say it. They're hungry and you have exactly what they need. But instead, you give them the thing they say they need, which is money, and not the thing that they might really need. So now I want to talk about the next need, which I call the need for agency. And it's a little more complicated than the other needs. So I want to take a minute and explain it. Agency means this: to have a voice. Agency means to have a voice. Let's just think about this for a minute. In one way, you guys focus on agency all the time, which is you fight for workers to have a right to and have a say in decision-making at the job, to have a voice in decision-making. So you already know what agency is at that level. It has to do with having an influence. But now, there's another aspect to agency that I think is interesting and important. Have you ever heard anyone say, maybe an artist or a writer, say something like, "It took me a long time to find my voice, to find my real voice"? What does that mean, really, to find your real voice? What are they talking about? Doesn't it mean something like this, that it's finding a way of expressing yourself that conveys who you really are, that conveys what is really unique in you, something that's all yours? That's part of agency. Agency then also means the capacity to express who you really are, to be the real author of your life. So we say that the need for agency, then, is the need to be self-determining and the need to be creative together. Okay? So let me give you a couple of examples. In 2005, I visited the 1199 Ohio Leadership Assembly, and they were acknowledging in a grand show of recognition 8 members that had been part of the Unseen America Project. And for those of you who don't know, the Unseen America Project was a project in which union members were given cameras and shown how to use them and sent out to take pictures and given some training and some feedback. For many of them, it was a very moving, transformative experience because they couldn't afford a camera themselves. They didn't know they had talent, and turns out they did. And every person who was in that project in Ohio that I talked to had a new relationship to their union where they were excited and more connected and grateful that the union had provided them this opportunity. And one of them even had his photo put into the book that came out, the Unseen America Project, and was flown to New York, and they had a big opening at the Metropolitan Museum, and it was a very exciting thing because for many folks it expanded their sense of who they were. And then finally, just last year, SEIU held a contest called Everybody Wins to solicit ideas for new ideas for quality public services. And the winner was a guy, Matt Edgerton, a school custodian in Local 925 in Washington State, who won for leading a team of students and staff at his school to come up with a plan to get rid of almost 100,000 styrofoam trays that were being thrown away every year. And here's what Matt said about it. Okay, we're thinking about agency now. He said, "I'd love to explain what we're doing to interested community members and tell them that we're able to do this because my labor union sponsored the idea with a grant. I always am given a smile and a comment along the lines of, SEIU, huh? I didn't know unions did stuff like that. This always leaves me with a great sense of pride that I'm a member of a union that places a value on quality public services, which I believe is necessary for unions to be successful and have an impact." So, in other words, Matt was rewarded and recognized for being creative and to see his ideas implemented with the active support and sponsorship of his union. So when you challenge and reward people for being creative, when you recognize their agency, their desire to learn, you expand their identity, you expand their sense of themselves beyond being a worker or a member. And a lot of incredible things can happen. They get energized, they get connected. And so, again, ask yourself this: how much do you think you think about and conspire to provide the opportunities and the space for members to exercise their sense of agency? And how much agency do they have within the local when it comes to its functioning? And how much do your members think about the local as a place where they can be creative and where they can learn? Okay. Now, the next need is the need for meaning. Okay? The need for meaning. And I'm going to show you a series of slides that illustrate this. The definition is simple. It's the need to be connected to something bigger than the self. It's a need for significance in being part of something beyond the limits of one's individual ego. And it takes all sorts of forms in everyday life and expressions, all sorts of expressions. For instance, it's there in our relationship to children because it's being connected to future generations, to a sense of going on being beyond one's own individual lifetime. This next slide shows blacks sitting at a lunch counter because it's there in social activism, which is making your mark in history, changing the world, a sense of a greater purpose. It's there in work, a sense of changing the world through work, about leaving your imprint, about having a bigger purpose. It's there even, believe it or not, in many people's relationship to sports teams and their communities. Finally, spirituality and religion satisfies people's need for meaning. To be connected to something transcendent, like God, is extremely powerful because it meets people's need for meaning. You know, transcendent means to go beyond the evidence of the senses. And I can tell you that, you know, over 30% of your members are active churchgoers of some kind, and over 50% say religion is an important part of their lives. So I've often found it bizarre that in many locals that may have ordained ministers in them as members or as member leaders, that religion and God and spirituality isn't mentioned much. Why is that? I mean, there are traditions within each religion that sponsor the most progressive politics, you know? But we don't talk about it. And when the need for meaning is frustrated, the result is cynicism. See, we shrink back into the narrow confines of the self, where there's nothing beyond your five senses. Then everyone becomes a salesman trying to get his or her own. So cynicism is about being small. Meaning is about being big. And cynicism comes when people's need for meaning is frustrated. So how do you engage your members' needs for meaning? How do you create space and activity and an atmosphere in which their need for meaning is engaged? So the last need I'm going to talk about is the need for recognition. Okay? By recognition, I mean being seen, understood, and appreciated for who you really are. People work for less money to get it. People work harder to get it. People come into therapy to get it, you know, simply to be listened to be understood for who you are without having to constantly perform or put on a false self. But you know what's sad, and I notice it in my practice and I notice it often in the union, is that people are embarrassed about their need for recognition. They think it's selfish and weak and dependent. They think they're high maintenance. They have the idea that they're not supposed to need too much recognition. They settle for crumbs. And so when they have a need for recognition, they tend to suppress it. And you know what happens then? They become bad recognition givers. It's harder for them to give recognition if they can't allow themselves to openly ask for and need it. You know, you guys in many ways are like, I would call it this, you're like camels in the desert. Adapted to go for long distances without water. In this case, without recognition. The problem is, it's not a desert. There's water all around. There's recognition to be found in most of your interactions. And I'll tell you, I've talked to people about this so much that I'll have to share this irony, this ironic finding that I've made, which is this. Everyone I talk to says, I don't get enough recognition in my job. At the same time, 5 minutes later, they say, I'm very good at giving recognition. You know, that's the thing. In my team, with my direct reports, I give lots of recognition all the time. Well, hello? How's that possible? Something's not right. Everybody's giving a lot of it, but no one's getting enough of it. The answer is they're not giving enough of it. They're giving crumbs, and they're acting like it's a whole loaf. it's almost impossible. Of course, recognition has to be selective, has to be well-timed, it has to be specific, it has to be genuine. But given that, it's almost impossible, in my view, for you to give too much recognition. And I've heard all the excuses about why it shouldn't be a big deal for people to need recognition. Like, you know, if I give it to Joe, I'm going to have to give it to Bob. Or why should someone get recognition for just doing their job? It's all bullshit. All of it. None of it's right. None of it makes sense. And all of it gets in the way of creating a culture in your local where people can really feel recognized in a good way. Now, and I would say, just to remind you, that as this next slide shows, that people are starving for it. You know, and I love this slide. It's always good boy, good dog, never great dog. So let me show you a brief film clip here. And I'm going to introduce it in this way. It shows another dimension of recognition. It's a video made of a family sitting around a kitchen table. It's an educational video made for therapists, okay? It's got a voiceover that unfortunately is a little bit intrusive. I apologize for that, but it can't be helped. And it's about the parent-infant relationship. So you're going to see a woman, a mother, come in and sit down at the kitchen table and start talking to an interviewer who is off camera about her baby. They have subtitles because the audio quality isn't very good. I want you to pay close attention, though, and think about the following question while you're watching this. Is there anything specifically about this interaction that might apply to the interactions between union staff and members? Okay, so let's show the video now.
The old cliche says, what you see is what you get. But what do we see when we look at our baby? Sometimes what we see is skewed a bit by a misinterpretation of baby's behavior. How would it feel to a parent to believe her baby does not like her?
Because you don't like me, Michael. You only like her daddy.
How would it feel to believe baby only liked daddy and was miserable when daddy was gone? A special problem since daddy is a truck driver.
She don't like me.
Why do you think it began just at that second?
Because she realized maybe she looked over seeing you on this lap. She was jealous.
But she had seen him before.
I don't think so.
Tanya, Tanya, what's the matter, baby?
That's Max. She's going to wring her hands.
She's gonna
Wring her hands. That's what I do.
How might this belief affect a parent's feelings about and response to this baby? And what if there were another baby, this one's twin, and we knew that mother believed he does like her?
You can have her. You gotta learn to share your daddy. He's not just your daddy. No, him not. Him a lot of kids' daddy. And you got to learn to share him. I don't care. You got to learn to share him.
Indeed, these twins were different at birth, as most are. And most parents of twins do, of course, relate differently to each of these individuals they have birthed. But the actual differences in these babies have now been covered over by mom's feelings. Feelings that may be connected to her daddy, having left her when she was a baby. Later, it will improve, but right now they are not fitting well.
So I think you can see here that the mother here projects her feelings onto this baby. And the baby then becomes the baby that the mother sees her as being. And the story starts in the family that she, the baby, was always a daddy's girl. But you can see the beginning of it here has a lot to do with the mother's interpretation of the baby. What you see is what you get. So the question is, do union staff do that? Do you do that? Do you assume that, well, members just want their benefits? Maybe that's your version of it. Or members don't want to get involved. Or members don't want us involved in their lives outside of work. They don't want me nosing around in their private life. These statements delivered with authority based on some conversations, are you really seeing who the real member is? Or, like this mother, are you seeing the member that you've constructed? And maybe all the time, both are going on. And it's important to be mindful and aware that that's a possibility. So let me finish then with this assertion, coming back to the core of the matter here. Expanding your view of members to include non-survival needs is actually crucial to your organization's survival. Okay? For a social change organization to be effective maximally, it has to address all 5 of these needs. It's what the megachurches do. You know, they set the bar very low for entry. People can come in and have needs for recognition met, and learning, and agency, and relationships, and spirituality. I think that if you don't do that, and you stay at the level of understanding your members as primarily motivated by a need for economic security, you narrow your view. You narrow your view of members. In other words, you have to go beyond survival in order to survive. And with that paradox, I'll stop. Thank you.